Welcome, everyone. I am delighted you're here with us for another summer special. We are having so much fun this summer, and I am thrilled to have Adrienne with me today. I've been waiting to talk to her for a long time. She does such amazing things, and I'm just so excited to talk to her. So welcome, Adrienne.
Thank you so much, Carol.
Well, we are excited, and we're just going to jump right in. One of the things I always like to start with is, you're so immersed in history, and in my mind, I just naturally always see you in the history world. But what was it that brought you to the world of history, and especially to the Tudors?
Well, I just have always loved history for most of my life. I can't even remember what specifically drew me to it in the first place. But I had a really kind of difficult childhood. And so I was a huge reader, and I would just get lost in these stories. And, I remember reading like Island of the Blue Dolphins as a kid. And, there's another writer, and I'm totally blanking on what her name is right now, but she wrote a lot of young adult books that were set, like there was one set during the Boston Massacre, and one set, during, it was another time period, I don't remember, but like I would devour those. And so, in school, my history classes, my history teachers were always my favorite. I always loved those classes, and I really kind of started to idolize them a little bit. And so I wanted to be a history teacher. And I went to college, and I started a program to be secondary education, social sciences. But what I found was that my classes just did not prepare me for being in front of kids, for teaching, and for being able to manage a classroom. And I'm kind of a pushover. So, I actually did go into the classroom to observe, and it was one of my teachers from high school who I absolutely loved. And he was a veteran teacher, like 20 plus years of teaching. And even he could not control his classroom. And I thought, oh, I'm in trouble. I can't do it. There's no way me, this 21-year-old who was like super meek, is going to be able to do it. So I ended up like, I was literally just about to student teach. That was the next thing I had to do, because I had done everything else in the program, and I switched.
Wow.
I switched my major. I ended up getting a minor in community service, and my major in liberal studies, because I had all the economics and political science and history. I took every history class except for one that my school offered. And so I just switched to that, but I was always super interested in history ever since then. And so I would read a lot of historical fiction and history books. And then how I got into the Tudors was, of course, how everybody gets into the Tudors, the other Boleyn girl, like anybody else ever responds. And I haven't left since. So here I am.
Oh, that is great. That is great. So I'm going to just ask about a few of your novels, and because there's always like a twist, which I love, and I love the attention you spend on the research. So we're going to talk about that separately, but I want to talk about your first novel, and you need to help me make sure I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Okay.
Because I always, in my head, it's always Cor Rotto. Is that right?
Yeah, that's probably right. I call it Cor Rotto, but I am not, I don't know Latin.
Okay.
Which is what it is. It means brokenhearted in Latin. So I think you probably are saying it right.
Well, I don't know, but anyway, it's Catherine Carey, and one of the things, and you can talk about the novel because it's just this amazing story of a real
Thank
person.
you.
And that's what I love is these are real people, but you question some of the assumptions. So the title comes from, so Catherine and Elizabeth I, who is not queen when she first writes that letter, right? Or is she queen?
Right.
She's not queen yet.
She's
So
no, she's still princess.
and so Catherine has left like other the term Protestant doesn't mean the same thing, but we sort of
Right.
use it. So other Protestants have left during the reign of Mary I. And Elizabeth and Catherine are very close. They're cousins and they're very close. And Elizabeth is saying she's brokenhearted to have Catherine gone. But there's an assumption on when that letter is written that people have just sort of taken for granted, but you question that. So tell us about what it's like, because you do this research and you have all these reasons to question it, but to sort of take on an assumption that
Yeah.
is sort of adopted without any, any definite reason. So tell us about that. That just seems so exciting as an author.
It is. I mean, it really is amazing. I love finding these little treasures. And, I had something similar that I found when I was researching Raven's Widow. So when we talk about that one, I can, again, kind of tell you about that story. But with the Cor Rotto, it is dated. It was found in William Cecil's papers, and it was dated by Cecil himself as at 1553. And so, the tendency is to believe that that was when it was dated. And I do actually think that it was dated for 1553, but the more that I started looking at what was going on in Catherine's life during that time, I mean, she was heavily pregnant. And I mean, we know what pregnant women in the Tudor period, like they were kind of kept locked up and confined, you
Right.
know, towards the later portion of their pregnancies. And this would have fallen right in that time period, so there's just no way that Catherine would have been going on this really, dangerous kind of mission. And one of the things that I kind of discovered as part of this is that we always operate under the assumption that these people left because they were really scared of Mary, right?
Mhm.
Well, there definitely is a part piece to that, but what I found in my research was that William Cecil was kind of working with like Robert Dudley and with Elizabeth and the people that supported her to really go across the continent and
Mhm.
learn how to set up these churches. So, and Francis Knowles, Catherine's husband, he was a part of this group, and he was really close to William Cecil. And Cecil basically sent him over there to really learn how to establish these churches, how to worship in the Protestant or Reformed way. And so if you look at it that way, right, if they were really terrified, then obviously they would take the risk of taking Catherine over. But even when they did go, and she is noted as being in Germany in 1557, so this
Mhm.
is 3 years later, she actually is referenced. I know where they stayed, who they stayed with, and what members of the family, they left some of their children back in
Right.
England when they went. So to me, that wasn't the story of somebody who was really scared,
Mhm.
right? So you would, if you were scared, you would take that risk. Even if you were heavily pregnant, you'd take all of your children and you
Right.
would go. But they didn't. They
Yeah.
didn't do that. And it's actually documented who was with Francis when he went on his trip in 1553. And it was their eldest son, Henry. There's no mention of Catherine. So it was pretty clear that Catherine did not go. But I started to really think about what was the atmosphere then, because people were being burned. There
Mhm.
was some, some fear, and all these people are coming and going. And I love the story of Catherine Willoughby when she's going over to Germany, and she just has her whole train, like almost her whole house, and she's just like tromping across England, you know, bold as bold as you can be. And so we have this narrative that people were so terrified they were leaving under the cover of night, but
Right.
that just was not true. Some people probably were, but it certainly wasn't the peerage
Mhm.
people.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I just was kind of thinking about this, and I thought, how easy is it that Elizabeth is under the assumption that Catherine is going, right? I mean, it would be so easy for her to think that. And maybe there was a plan that Catherine was going to go, and at the last minute, she didn't. So I do think that since, Cecil himself dated that letter, and he would have been best placed to know. I do think it was in 1553, but it could very well have been written in 1557 when we know for sure
Mhm.
that Catherine did go. And who knows when he dated it? I can't remember things I did 2 weeks ago.
Right. Yes. And you certainly know if Cecil's looking back and he's remembering that Francis was there in 1553, he might have thought, oh, yeah, that's when they all came over, forgetting the details because his wife
Yeah,
was with Francis, which does make
right.
some sense. That was the way Cecil was experiencing because he was working with Francis. And
Yes.
I love that idea that it wasn't so much a flee and hide. It
Yeah.
was a go and prepare the continent and how we can work with the continent. I mean, it was very strategic
It
in a
really
lot of
was.
ways.
Yeah, yeah. And I found a lot of evidence for that. There's this really, really great book called The Marian Exiles by Christina Garrett. And I have found so much information in there. It breaks it down by who actually went over there, what settlements that they went to, all of these different things. And then and this book was written, I think, in like, I don't know, maybe the 30s or the 40s. It's a
Ah,
really old book, but she had done so much research that I was able to track down, and she was the one who put that idea into my head that
mm,
this was very strategic, this is what they were doing, because I had never heard that before.
right.
And so, I followed her citations. I looked at the primary documents, and sure enough, there's these letters from Cecil, and he's talking about what his plans are and who is meeting and who,
Mhm.
all of these different things. So I think that oftentimes we are so quick to dismiss something that's really old. Because I mean, look at Agnes Strickland, right? Her
Yeah,
book is very skewed and very, because it was written under the Victorian period and all
right,
of that.
right.
So, and we want to dismiss her because it's so old and it's so dated. And we want to dismiss these books that were written in, 1539. But there are really some hidden gems in there if you take the
Yes,
time to look at it and follow up on this,
right.
sources. Yeah.
Right. No, I think that's really great and a really important point that sometimes we've layered on some assumptions. And I think the one just about why people are going, that it was all out of fear, and it wasn't all out of fear. There's
Right.
certainly was some, of course, there were people getting burned,
Yeah.
but there were also those who, for business reasons and all kinds of reasons, just saw that their life would be better on the continent for a while. So I think
Yeah.
that's really great. The other thing I love about this, before we move on to the next book, but love about this is this relationship between Elizabeth and Catherine, and just the notion, because we often are given portrayals of Elizabeth as being cold and distant, especially with women, right? She's big flirt with men, but not kind to the women who serve her. And we hear these stories about she broke somebody's finger, and we kind of get that version. But there were also real friendships and a family connection here.
Yes.
So can you talk to us just a little bit about that family? Because Elizabeth didn't have a lot of family, but you do see these close ties. And I love this female friendship that you see in this particular relationship.
Yeah. And a lot of it was the things that I read after Catherine died. I mean, Elizabeth was inconsolable. She wouldn't even come out. Like, there were diplomats there who wanted to see her. She would not even come out of her rooms. She was not, and so, and you look at, I actually translated the funeral roll for Catherine Carey, which was super exciting. Oh my gosh, I still can't believe that they asked me to do it.
That's so wonderful.
Seeing the people who attended this funeral and seeing the amount of money that Elizabeth spent on it, it was just really obvious to me that she lost somebody who was really beloved to her. And towards the end of her life, there are these letters, because Francis was over in, I think it was Kimbolton, with Mary Queen of Scots. And he's writing these letters back to court, and he's writing letters back to Catherine. And he very much treats Catherine, and he calls her basically like the other half of me, and which is so sweet and so kind of unique for the Tudor period to have that deep of a love connection.
Such a love marriage. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And he's basically, treating her as though she is his equal when it comes to Elizabeth. Like, anything that he wants, he has Catherine speak to her. He has Catherine relay it to her. She gives her messages that are hard for her to hear. And there's just kind of this really emotional connection. And even in the way he's like writing letters to Robert Dudley and William Cecil, and the way that Cecil and Dudley talk about Catherine back to him. Like Robert Dudley, he talks about how, he's chastising Catherine because she's not eating and she's not taking care of herself and she's not doing all of these things that, she's running herself ragged. And so, you don't really see Dudley talking about other women in that sort of intimate really way. And so, if you look at all these extra little pieces of the puzzle, you see that, like, obviously Catherine was right there with Elizabeth all the time.
Yeah. And that's just a really wonderful thing to think about. And I think that also pushes back at some of the assumptions about Elizabeth and, but it's a really warm relationship. And I just think Catherine inspires, because her relationship with Elizabeth is unique among some of Elizabeth is close to some other people, but she has this great relationship with Catherine. And then the marriage between Catherine and Francis is just off the charts romantic, especially for the time.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I loved one of the letters that I found. He was so mad at Elizabeth because Elizabeth could be, she was moody, Yes. I don't think she was cold-hearted. Like, I don't buy into that narrative of her, but she could be really moody. And we always hurt the ones that we love the most because we know that they're going to still love us back.
Right,
Even,
right,
it's,
right.
and so it was almost like Catherine was kind of this safe place
Uh-huh.
for Elizabeth to just really lose her cool and just, she must have at some point, she must have done something, or it was that, because she wouldn't let Francis come home.
Right.
Um, and and that's another thing that I found so wonderful is that Elizabeth literally said, I am sending Francis because every man I send to marry Queen of Scots gets charmed by her. They all get taken in by her and then they want to support her. And like,
Mm-hmm.
we're sending Francis because he's so in love with his wife. He is never going to be
That's right.
charmed.
Mm-hmm. And
I
it was true.
absolutely loved
Yeah.
that. Yeah. But Francis did write, there was this letter where he wrote back to Catherine and he was just livid with Elizabeth. It was just, I don't care. We're leaving court. We're going to go out into the
Uh-huh.
country. I don't care how poor we are. We're out.
It is great. I've read that. And it's just like, this is a man who loves his wife, who wants to be with his wife, and who will walk away from this amazing career because the career's keeping him away. To succeed in his career, he has to do what Elizabeth wants, and she wants him there, and Catherine at court. But it's a great, like, we're out of here. I love that. You're right. That is a great letter.
Successful Tudor men, right, are gonna leave their careers for their women. That just does not happen because typically they're marrying somebody who is helping them,
Right.
promote their career.
Yeah.
They make these dynastic marriages and that's what they're looking for. And yes, like in many ways, Catherine did help promote, Francis's career because she was so close to Elizabeth and
Right.
possibly Elizabeth's sister, right?
Mm-hmm.
So even if it wasn't a love match, it was still a good dynastic sort of marriage. But the fact that he was like, I'm out, I don't care, we'll be poor. A lot because Tudor men did not want to be poor.
Right. No, it may not have started as a total love match, but it certainly grew into a total love match. And that's great.
Yes.
And that's probably a good transition because the next novel is about a marriage that, again, I think we've made a lot of assumptions about because, and we all think it's totally not a love match, that there's no happiness there. So tell us about starting that, what got you interested in that, what drew you to that story. So tell us all about that.
Well, I read Julia Fox's book about Jane when I was researching Cor Rotto. And, so I definitely made sure that in Cor Rotto, she obviously wasn't perfect, but she was much more sympathetic than I think you usually would see. But then, I went back after Cor Rotto came out and I was kind of thinking about who I wanted to write about next. And I ended up picking up Julia Fox's book again and really reading it. I had just kind of skimmed it beforehand and, just got what I needed and didn't really like wholeheartedly dive into it. And so I started reading it, and it was right about the time I had had hysterectomy. So I was home and, I was really emotional because, you're dealing with those feelings of like, wow, this chapter of my life is over. I don't know if I'm ready for that. It was medically necessary. So I'm sitting at home being, very emotional and very in pain and just kind of not feeling myself. And so I picked up Julia Fox's book, started reading that again. And of course, and the reason why I picked it up was because this happened at the end of January, early February, when we're seeing all those posts on Facebook about Jane and Catherine's execution. And so I'm reading this book, seeing all these things about her and dealing with my own internal struggles with not being able to have any more children. And I just really, I don't know, I connected with her in this sense of, here is this Tudor woman, and what is the one job of a Tudor woman? Have children, right?
Right.
Have heirs. That is like the one thing, like, you had one job.
Yeah, right. That's very much a you had one job for a Tudor wife. Yes.
And she, for whatever reason, we don't know, that did not happen for her and George. And I started thinking about this, the fact that George was the only male child in that family. He was the heir. He stood
To the whole Boleyn future,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Right, the whole Boleyn future. They were rising at court. He had this just like legacy to inherit, and he didn't have any children to inherit it, right? So how did that weigh on him, and how did it weigh on her? The pressure, and there's studies talking about how when there's high stress, high anxiety, all of these things, it does make it more difficult to conceive children. And then I'm reading in Julia Fox's book, and she's talking about all these, diplomatic missions that George is on, and how based upon their religion, there were certain days of the week they could not, have sex. And there was, and so she kind of was like breaking down this, okay, well, maybe they could have hit here, or maybe they could have here, but George is sleeping in the king's room most of the time.
Right. That's the other thing. George's career has skyrocketed, as Anne Boleyn becomes more important to the king, so does George. And so that takes him away from his wife.
Right.
Even in terms of location. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we really based this idea that they had a bad marriage largely on the fact that they didn't have children. Everybody tries to come up with this reasoning for why Jane would have hated George enough to testify against him, which she didn't. I mean, we have no proof that she did.
Right.
And so they trace the root, that is the root cause. And so I thought, well, what if they just couldn't have kids?
Yeah.
Right? What if for whatever reason the dates didn't line up, or perhaps maybe she had gynecological challenges, or maybe he did. I mean, we really don't know. And and it's possible, and I mean, this is just something that just came to me as I'm talking to you, but we talk about how Henry maybe had Kells, or Anne was, I think it's the R negative.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking
RH
about, right?
negative. Yeah.
RH negative. Yeah. So was George RH negative? If Anne was RH negative, was George? How does that affect? I mean, this is something that just popped into my head, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to go look at this. Is this something males can carry? I mean, so it could have been George. It could have been it could have been any number of reasons that they didn't have a child. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was because they hated each other. And there are a lot of Tudor marriages where they did hate each other and they still had children. So
those two don't necessarily go together.
Yeah, for sure. So thought, well, if we remove that, what else is there to say that they didn't like each other? Well, there was nothing. I could not find anything. And instead, I just found instance after instance after instance that Jane really actually was in favor with the Boleyns, and she put herself on the line a lot of times for them, in support of them. And Anne kept her close. Anne put her in her coronation procession right by her side, in a place that she was actually not entitled to be. Even her sister, Mary, she's in the back of the line, But here's Jane, front and center, right alongside Anne. And so I just thought, this to me seems like it seems very far-fetched that they hated each other, that she hated the Boleyns, that she, so I just kind of dove down the rabbit hole.
Right,
And that's
right.
where I, landed.
And that's great, because you do see, I mean, that conversation about the king not being quite as manly as he would like everyone to believe involved Jane. If there was all this animosity between Anne and Jane, would you be that honest with someone you hated?
Right. You wouldn't.
I just don't think so. So that's great. And it brings Jane as a character, as a person, into a different light when you see her as part of the Boleyn family, part of the close family, rather than, as she is often cast, as sort of the outsider, never able to get in.
Yeah.
So I just think that's really interesting. So now we're going to just take that notion of seeing people in a different light to another Jane. So I think that it just turns out to be another Jane, but I think that's really interesting. And it turns out to be Anne Boleyn again. So in your newest book, The Keeper of the Queen's Jewels, there's this different way of looking at Jane Seymour and also Marjorie Horseman. So we need to talk about both of them because they both play this important role. But I was particularly intrigued by your considering Jane Seymour's response to what happens in May of 1536, because we, of course, focus on Anne and the horrible, terrifying, just things slipping out of control so fast. It's just unbelievable. Yeah. But part of that is no one believed that Anne would actually be executed. I mean, just no one believed that going in. Chapuis, even her enemies did not believe that would happen. And you bring up the notion that, of course, that was likely Jane could not believe that would happen. That was just inconceivable. Yeah. So I do think I would love to talk about that, because I've never looked at another book that considers Jane's response to that in that way. It just usually starts with Jane and the king after they're married, and then alludes to, oh yeah, they were together during this time, but never really focuses on her watching May and what happened, and knowing as things just go completely out of control, that's the person whose place she's going to be taking. Yeah. And she saw Anne as the beloved, for so long, and look what's happening to her now, and you want me to take that. So talk to us a little bit about that, because I just was so struck by that when I read it.
Well, it kind of, there were a couple of things that really fed into that for me. So I actually decided to write about Jane Seymour because I was not ready to let Jane Boleyn go. I was still thinking about her. I still think about her and still research her even now. And it's, that book has been out for years. She's kind of my Tudor bestie, I joke. But, so as I was researching Jane and Marjorie, and it originally was supposed to be, the story was supposed to be about Marjorie. But as I started researching her, I was having trouble actually finding anything about her. We literally know like maybe 3 or 4 things about her, about Marjorie, and that's it. And so I was having trouble really kind of trying to put together a story. But as I got to actually getting ready to sit down and write, a few things were happening. So we already had the Me Too movement that was going on. And we're seeing these really powerful men like Henry Weinstein. What that's his name, right? Henry
Mhm.
Weinstein?
Mhm.
Harvey, that's it. Let's see, Henry Harvey. And I started as these things were like coming out about Harvey Weinstein. I kept picturing Henry, right? I kept
Yeah.
like in my brain, I just kept connecting them, and I could see Henry doing some of those things because he was kind of a, he was kind of a creeper with women, and so that was happening. And at the same time as it's, all these women are starting to come forward and really talking about the hidden abuse, right? We think of domestic abuse as being a hit or a push or something physical. We think of, seeing a woman with bruises or,
Mhm.
something like that. But really, domestic abuse, the scars can happen inside, and they can, in your mind, and they can be very manipulative, they can be very narcissistic. And then at about the same time as we are coming into the coronavirus, I discovered my husband was having an affair. And at the time, there was like a pretty big stretch of time between me really kind of discovering it and him, of course, denying it, and us getting to a resolution where we're going to divorce. And in that time period, there was a lot of, I was being lied to a lot. I was being very heavily manipulated and gaslit and all of these things. And of course, to be quite honest, if I wasn't observant and knowledgeable about what was going on in the world as these stories are coming out, I likely would not have seen what was happening to me.
Okay.
Um, and because he was so good at it, right?
Mm.
And he was like that person that I trusted fully, and I believed, and I like, it was just so completely out of the blue. And to this day, a lot of our friends are just like, what? Like, I still can't believe this happened. I thought he was like devoted to you, and so I just became aware of what was happening to me, and how easily that happens, right? It doesn't take a
Mhm.
lot of effort when you put your trust into somebody. It doesn't take a lot of effort for them to manipulate you and to get you to believe what they're telling you. And so after like the divorce was final and I got settled because I had to move and sell my house and just all these things, we split custody. And so my son would go and stay with him for half the time. And while he was gone, I just became super introspective and trying to figure out, because I needed to unwind this. And it didn't start with him. I mean, growing up, I was manipulated and gaslit a lot. I lived in an emotionally abusive home. I, grew up with a lot of trauma. And so I started kind of unwinding all of these pieces. And I started to see so many of these things in Jane, in the way that Henry would treat her, in the way that Henry would gaslight her and make her believe that she was wrong. I mean, who can who can read that exchange of him, her going to him and dropping to her knees and saying, your people are hurting because of what you're doing.
Right.
You need to fix that. And she's begging for them. And he just slaps her down, tells her, you better watch your step or you're going to end up just like the woman before you. I brought her up and took her down. I can do the same to you. And just imagine that happening in front of everybody.
In front of everybody. Right.
It's for the queen, and you are supposed to be this idealized version of a woman, right? You're saintly almost. You can't be, people can't touch you.
Right.
You have to have this aura. There's,
Yep.
and he just, in that one exchange, he just wipes that whole thing away, and she has to rebuild that reputation and rebuild that, and I saw a lot of sort of trauma responses in her, how she was so strict about what her ladies were wearing, down to the number of pearls that they had on their outfits. And just to me, do you think Jane actually really cared about that? No, but it was all about rebuilding this idealized version, because that's how a queen is supposed to be seen.
Right.
But we've seen Henry tear down the queen before. We're seeing him tear her down. And so she's kind of caught in this crossfire of, this is what I'm supposed to be. But how do I do that when I'm constantly,
and two, at that point, she also realizes, even if she's told herself to believe that Anne must have been guilty, he's just made it very clear that Anne wasn't guilty, that he just got rid of her because she annoyed him. I mean, so that also must have shattered any thought that I'll be okay because I won't do what Anne did. Because it's obvious Anne didn't do what he said Anne did, and that must have been just so terrifying. Yeah.
So it just really, I thought about the emotions I was going through. I thought about the emotions that other women talked about going through. And I really started to see some of that stuff in Jane. And I thought, I think we have her wrong. I really do. Because Jane would have to be really cruel to truly think that it was okay that Anne was murdered. She would have to be really cold-hearted to have influenced the king to kill her, to have thought that it was okay. We love to blame women, and so Jane, she gets blamed like, oh, well, she charged the king and talked him into, no. That did not happen. And and as I could see from other things that Jane did in her life, and especially during her short reign, she was not cold-hearted. She was really kind, and she was really caring. She cared about the people that she ruled over. And one of the ways that I kind of demonstrated that, and I haven't seen it in another novel, and that's part of why I wrote that in there, is the scene where, she's the petitioners are coming in to see her, because that did happen. We read these fiction novels, and the queens are always it's like they're enmeshed in these dramas, right? But we never really see the day-to-day life that the boring administrative
right. Yeah.
So I wanted to put that in there to kind of remind people, these people had jobs. They did. They
Yes,
had
right.
jobs. It wasn't all glamour and glitz and buffets and dances all the time. They had these really day-to-day jobs, and it just gave me an opportunity to show, that Jane really did care about her people, and she wanted to help them in the best way that she could. And there are quite a few examples of her. She just send some deer to the chapel singers, and
Mhm, mhm.
she does all of these things, and I think it's just really endearing.
Right, right.
Right.
And I think too, because she gives Henry a son, and then from then on, he loves her, right? From then on, and then she dies, so immediately.
Yeah.
And since no one else gives him a son, then she becomes his favorite wife. But I'm not sure
Mhm.
at the time it felt like that to her, because he was saying
Oh,
terrible things and, talking to people about, oh, wish I'd met you before, and
yes.
also just if you look date wise, Catherine of Aragon got pregnant really quickly. Anne Boleyn got pregnant really quickly. It takes Jane months, and that must have been
Yes.
terrifying.
Oh, absolutely. I cannot even imagine. And of course, because of that, that's probably what took so long. I mean, she was under a lot of duress,
Yeah. Yes.
really, a
Yes.
lot of pressure. And I feel like Henry was just constantly kind of reminding her. So
Right.
in my book, I have him touching her waist a lot,
Yeah.
and kind of, these little just things that,
Right.
always reminding me I need
Right. No,
to.
no, there's no question. She would have
Mhm.
always known what her one job was for him.
Yeah.
And um okay, so you've alluded to, that's so great. You've alluded to your research, and that's one of the things I love about your books is, and also I've heard you talk about this, how important the research is to you.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about the way you go about your research, how you do your research, all that kind of thing? Because I think sometimes people forget how much research goes into nonfiction,
Yeah.
and then how much research goes into fiction as well. So, you don't even understand how much goes into nonfiction. And then you think, oh, yeah, well, fiction's easy. You just make everything up. But
Right.
not at all true. So tell us about the research that you do in your novels, for your novels.
So, I mean, I try to get into as much as I can. I try to go to the primary documents. I've gone to the British Library, and I've held George Boleyn's book. I have done, all of these really great. I went to Wolf Hall and I had tea with, Edward Seymour's nephew of however many times.
Uh-huh.
I love to go and be in these places where people are, because there's such a vibe there. There's such a I don't know, like the history, energy, it really lends to the research itself. And then and sometimes when you go there, you can see certain things that wouldn't be possible, right? So it's just really interesting to me to discover all of the things that you can't get from reading
Mhm.
documents. But at the same time, I've probably gone through British history online for like, I don't know how many times, reading through all of the documents and pulling out, and sometimes it will, lead you to to going and finding more details, because the people who put those together, the editors, they mistranslated stuff and they left stuff out. And sometimes it's just like a summary of the document. So
Right.
then you have to
Yeah.
go and actually find the document. That was the thing with Marjorie Horseman. is that, I actually had to find her letter to Cromwell because it was just kind of summarized in letters and papers. And so, I had to request it from the archives and, do all of that stuff, which I found so fascinating to actually see the letter, and you see the
Mhm,
folds, so you can see how she folded it, you can see how
mhm,
she wrote her handwriting, and I think that that really tells you a lot about a person. And one of the things that was really funny was I saw the inventories of Henry the Eighth, and in the folder there was letters and a bunch of other things, but there's this letter that Risley wrote for him, and you could see Henry just like he's scratching things out and he's writing things on top of Risley's handwriting. And it's been so funny to like discover that stuff, because you can just see how bombastic he really is, and he just
mhm.
wants things done his way. Yeah.
Well, that's really true. And I think sometimes as you look at documents, you can see by the handwriting when somebody's upset
Yeah.
and when they're calmer and being more deliberate. I found that with some of Elizabeth's that I've been able to see. And that doesn't come through just in a transcript of the letter. So the emotion that is behind that, because their handwriting changes,
Yeah.
or something changes, and it's just so
Yeah.
cool. And I love that idea of um how important it is to get as close as possible to the documents themselves. And so
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing some of that, because I think that's great. And sometimes I think, oh, if I just lived in England, right, I could just make appointments and go to these places all the time. But it is, you have to make these trips and plan things and, try and cram
Mhm.
a whole bunch into a trip. So, um, as a reader, let me thank you for all the work you do on your research, because it really does just makes
Thank
the
you.
novels really sing, because you can count on the research. The stories are wonderful and the characterization is wonderful, but it's built on a really solid historic research foundation. And I think that's what makes them so powerful. So I also wanted, and I know you just sort of mentioned it kind of in passing, that you were able to translate something
Mhm.
very special. So just as we sort of wrap up the research, can you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about that? Because I think that's such a cool story.
Yeah. So I actually made a connection at Grace Court, which was Catherine Carey's home. And, I reached out to them and said, I've written this book about Catherine. I really would love to see her home. I'd love to see her tomb at the church that's down the road. And so they, connected me with a historian who gave me this just brilliant tour. It was so great. And we after we kind of talked back and forth to each other. She's like part of this Grace Court history group. And anyway, she ended up reaching out to me a couple of years ago, and she was like, "You're never going to believe this, but one of our members discovered this this funeral roll, but we're having a hard time kind of doing the transcript. Do you want to take a look at it?" And I was like, "Yes."
Yes, please.
"Does the Pope wear a funny hat?" "Yes." Yeah, so she sent it over to me, and we spent some time like piecing it together, and it was great. Like I loved, really seeing all of these people who attended the funeral. And then also, because we could discover how many mourners there were,
Mhm.
we could kind of, Dr. Kristen Bundison and I kind of put together this like idea of when exactly Catherine was probably born, like what part of the year, what year. And it really kind of turned into something a bit scientific. But yeah, so it was really interesting to find that information out.
I just think that's so great, because to me, that is just this community of scholars working together. And I just love that you reach out to them and then later they reach out to you and you can collaborate. And I just love that story because, and I think that's also a testament to the dedication you have to doing the research, that you're really going to the source and continuing to go to the source. So I just love that story. So thank you for sharing. That's just a little indulgence for me because I love that so much. Well, before I let you go, can you tell us, are you working on anything special now? And where can we follow you and keep track of what you're doing?
So you can follow me I'm on Instagram and I'm very friendable on Facebook and I have a website. So it's adrienne-dillard.com. And then of course you can always go to greylondonpress.com, which is the publishing press that I established with author Sandy Vizzoli. And then you can just search my name on Instagram or Facebook.
And I'll have all those links in the show notes. So that'll be good.
Perfect. So right now I'm working on getting this master's degree.
Yes.
And at the same time, I have this story for Lettice Knowles rumbling around in my head. So I'm going to go back to my Carey family and discuss that.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I just love all the ways that family intersects with Elizabeth in really fascinating and important ways. So that's very exciting to know that that's rumbling in your head. That's a great place. That's great. Well, Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a real treat. And as I said, I'll have all the links and the books and links to that in the show notes. But I just so appreciate your speaking with us and helping us just really peek behind the scenes. Some of these stories we thought we knew and maybe didn't know as well as we thought. And that's what your books really do. I think they just give us a bright new spotlight on some of these times. And I really appreciate that. So thank you so much for joining us. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you everyone for listening. Hope you're all having a great summer and stay tuned. There's lots more fun happening this month and keep up shaking up history with all of us. Thank you so much.